Okay, we'll move to the General Manager's report. Mr. General Manager.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me report on a couple of things and then turn to what obviously has a lot of focus this morning, and that's on the service issues. First, our ridership. Now the reports do include the West ridership numbers, although they are relatively small comparison to the overall ridership. They are now being included within the reports to you, and we are obviously watching those very closely. Our overall ridership, weekly trips were up about 1%. Weekday trips increased 0.5 on the actual weekday. On weekends, they were up a bit higher than that. And I think what we're really seeing here is that even with the slowdown in the economy, with certainly the lower price for gasoline, that many of the people who chose to be able to ride transit in that high gasoline price period, really June on, although they have, some have gone back, many of them are still holding as transit riders. Generally speaking, our ridership numbers track the economy but are about 6 months behind. So we're going to have to watch what happens actually during this continued recession, very, very deep recession, and see where things are. But in the month of February, we did see increases both weekday and weekends, with higher levels on the weekends, and again tells us that people are using the service not just for that work trip, but are in fact using it increasingly for other trips as a way to be able to, we would believe, both economically makes sense, but also just from convenience side. We're, as I said, we're tracking this one very closely. Let me next turn to the issue of service. I think you all know that as about 55% of our overall revenue comes from the payroll tax. That's directly tied to the level of employment, and as unemployment rates have gone up, we certainly are facing decreasing payroll tax revenue. Earlier this year, announced that we would expect to be able to have about a $13.5 million budget deficit that we would need to address. At that point, I directed that we would have a 5% across the whole of the agency reduction. Because of the ability to be able to have stimulus dollars flowing, and in one narrow category of those stimulus funds flowing to transit, we were able to find ways to offset on the service side about half of that 5% cut. In the proposals that went out to the open houses, as well as what is coming here, and we're discussing today, and will go out to public hearing, reflects that. I also asked to be able to develop additional 3% contingency budget reductions based on the fact that the economy seemed to be continue to be able to go down. And therefore, the payroll tax revenues we would expect to be able to receive likewise to be able to be decreased. As of this morning, I've asked to be able to have the non-service portion of that additional 3% to be able to be implemented within TRIMET. Likewise, on the service side, because I think we all know we're very reluctant to be able to move ahead on service cuts unless absolutely necessary. We are waiting until about mid-May. That's the point when we will see the results of the actual payroll tax payments from the first quarter of the calendar year. That is the largest payment. It also gives us a good sense of where we are within the employment picture, and therefore payroll tax expectations. If we have to address an additional 3% reduction on the service side, we would attempt to be able to still utilize some stimulus dollars to offset some of the effects of that, but it would mean that we would have to have another round of looking at service reductions. Something in the transit world we think is the last thing we ever want to be able to see happen. We are not alone in this. All throughout not only the state, but the nation, transit agencies are in the exact same position, generally in many cases worse than we are, by seeing for many other places sales tax revenues decreasing even faster having to be able to look at fare increases and a series of other things. You may have been reading what the Metropolitan Transit Agency in New York is doing. They will actually be adopting today substantial service reductions and substantial fare increases. That is typical across the country. Even in our own state, in Lane County, Board Member Williams and I have met with a board member from there, as well as general manager, and they were looking at that point 15% reductions and substantial amounts of service cuts on reducing weekends, eliminating a number of weekend service, and other things as Board Member Williams will address. When we began this process at the beginning of this year and put out to the public for comment, we identified a series of reductions, none of which we wanted to be able to do, but were inevitable to be able to meet our budget needs. And those reductions were based principally on the following criteria. First, we looked at whether or not it was a heavily utilized line. Really, the ridership numbers. What was it affecting if we reduced or eliminated lines? Was it, in fact, adversely affecting large numbers of people? Understand, if you're the rider on one of those lines, it doesn't matter whether it doesn't affect anybody else, it's affecting you, and that is significant. So first off is in terms of ridership. Number two is we looked at coverage. That is, were there other alternatives available for individuals who had been using that line? May not be quite as convenient, may require a bit longer walk, maybe not quite as frequent service, but were there alternatives? And third, we wanted to make sure that essential trips, people who were using this as their only way to be able to get to a job, that we were addressing that need to the greatest degree possible. What we have had done is put together a series of recommended areas asking for public comment. During those open houses and lots of emails and other things, we received over 1,500 comments. You have received many of those. They've all been summarized and are in your packets today. And what we did is what I think we do exceedingly well, and that is we took into account those public comments. And you will hear today in detail about some of the places where we have been able to make changes. In fact, many of the places have been able to make changes. Again, not that it is restoring that service, but to be able to configure it in a way that has met our goals of making sure that people who were affected had alternative coverage, to be able to only address those places where the ridership was very low, and three, to be able to be very sensitive to those places where people who were transit dependent have no other alternatives. What we are now talking about is to have the actual formal public hearing process to begin, and there are dates that are established for that. I'll come back to those specific dates in a moment, but we want to be able to walk through and have the actual public hearing process. At the end of that, you, the TRIMET board, will need to be able to adopt a number of changes by ordinance. That requires a first and second reading by you, and we would expect that to come out after the public hearing and any additional modifications that will come from that. When we originally put out the service reductions to the public for comment, we proposed discontinuing 12 bus lines, eliminating some weekend service, and reduced frequency, as well as span of service, that is, the total number of hours over which we operated on a number of different routes. What we are before you today, and from the feedback that we received from those public comments, we are proposing to eliminate 5 lines, not the 12, but 5 lines, modify 4 lines, and combine 3 other lines. What I'd like to at this stage is to be able to walk through these, because these are important and detailed issues that are critical, and I think you will see from what was originally put out to proposal and some of the modifications that are being made, how we've really tried to address many, though we've not been able to address all of the concerns that have been expressed. To do that, I would ask Ken Zadarin from Service Planning to discuss the details of the proposal. After Ken's done, I'll come back to the actual public hearing schedule that we will still invite additional comments.
Ken.